On today's episode of Living Kosmos, I'm bringing me and it's meeting the other relationships in my life to form this social identity that I have. Which means that my worldview is not just my worldview, it's also co-enacted, co-created, not only by my world, but also all of my relationships and the culture that I'm a part of. And this is important because if I'm in a different relational or cultural context, who I know myself to be will be different. Welcome to the Living Kosmos podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sturm. Our focus is on the questions, who am I and what is my place in the cosmos? This exploration is in service to understanding our true nature on our path toward human realization. Today, we recognize that the universe has been on a journey of evolution from undifferentiated particles into life, consciousness, and even podcasts. You and I are vastly interwoven into this living, breathing cosmos. Our stories of healing, awakening, and self-actualization are each threads in the evolutionary tapestry of the cosmos. So, center in yourself and join me for this transmission. Welcome to the very first episode of the Living Kosmos podcast. My name is Matt, and I'm feeling really excited to be initiating this series. And thank you for choosing to join me. So we're going to begin by looking at worldviews. And there's kind of two reasons for that. The first is that worldviews, when I first began studying them, 4 or 5 years ago, my brain kind of exploded. And I was like, whoa, this is the thing. And then my internal landscape started to reorganize and change, and I kept studying it and researching and reading and talking and then teaching and sharing and offering around worldviews. And so part of this is me giving you an insight into who I am and what I'm passionate about. And the other piece is that probably the core focus of this podcast as I bring other guests on is going to be the question, who are you and how do you engage in the world that is special or unique to you? And take us into your worldview. So a worldview includes my identity, who I think I am. It also includes my values, my beliefs, what I think is important, how I think of the world makes sense of my reality, and that in turn informs how I engage with the world, my behavior. So a worldview is a pretty broad term, and all of us have one, and most of the time, it is this invisible lens that we are using to interpret. And the magic is if we take a step back, like we're wearing these glasses all the time, and we kind of think that that's what the world looks like through these glasses, and we forget that we're wearing glasses. So then if we take them off of our face and take a step back and then look at our worldview, our interpretive lens, we can see that maybe there's some pieces that have been developed from long ago that are ready to update, that I'm ready to shift and change for who I am today. And by looking at our worldview, by taking the subjective lens and making it an object of our observation, it is an incredibly powerful tool to grow and mature and change. And so I call this the evolution of consciousness. And when I say that term, some people get it. They're like keyed into it immediately. And other people are like, Well, that seems kind of woo woo, kind of far out. I don't really know. And for me, this is a very mundane, visceral, immediate experience that we're working on here, the evolution of consciousness, which is how I make sense of who I am and what the world is. And so that's my other goal here, is to invite you into your own exploration of what your worldview is and how you use it, and then eventually how we want to evolve our worldviews so that you kind of get it. And then we're on the same project together. So, my worldview holds my identity. And part of my identity is my name. Okay, so my name is Matt Sturm, and that's part of my identity. And then, if you were to ask the question, who am I? And keep asking that question and going deeper and deeper and deeper, you kind of land either at the void, there's no solid answer to that question, or consciousness, like the I am absolute awareness of space and reality. And so both of those are aspects of identity. But there's another component to identity which is really, really important, and it's where I want to focus here today. And that is the different roles that I wear in relationship and in my culture. So I have an identity of being a brother, and I have an identity around being a therapist. Both of those are relational. If I didn't have a sister, I wouldn't be in the role of being a brother. And if I didn't have clients and other colleagues around therapy where I was in the role of a therapist, then that identity wouldn't hold for me anymore. And we actually spend a good amount of time each day in these various roles that are part of our identity. And so there's an aspect of me, my unique self that I bring to each identity. Like, I'm not the average brother, I'm a pretty special brother because I bring my own sauce to it. But then there's also my sister and my family system, and then our culture, how we do family, that also weaves in to this identity. And I'm not your average therapist. I bring my own special sauce to being a therapist and holding space for people. But then there's also what therapy is as a social job role that gets defined by our culture and by all of the people who I interact with through that role. And that also feeds into my identity. So there's I'm bringing me, and it's meeting the other relationships in my life to form this social identity that I have. Which means that my worldview is not just my worldview, it's also co-enacted, co-created, not only by my world, but also all of my relationships and the culture that I'm a part of. And this is important because if I'm in a different relational or cultural context, who I know myself to be will be different. And, as I say that may seem obvious, but let's look into this. So I want to talk through 4 different worldviews, and I'll also use the word paradigm here. And the worldview is the internal understanding, and the paradigm is the actions, communications, practices, policies, institutions, and structures that can be measured in the manifest world. And they go together. So paradigm is the external, worldview is the internal. So let's talk through 4 of these and get a sense for them. The first one I'm going to call the mythic traditional paradigm. Now, I can remember primarily as a kid being in social structures where there was a really strong bond as a social group, where I was a member of that group, and one or a couple of people were leaders and they held the authority. And there was a really strong sense of this is what it means to be in this group, And here are the rules or the policies or the norms of how we do what we do. And the fact that we are in this group together means that not only are we special as opposed to people who are not in the group, but we're also protected. We're safe because we're part of the herd, the pack. And so this social structure, for me, growing up in the Catholic Church, I felt that. And grade school in particular, I felt that in my school. And there were certain sports teams that I participated in where it felt like that. And we can go more broadly, like political affiliations or sports teams that people are fans of today can also have this affiliation, this social structure. And within that, there's really an adherence to what it means to be your role in that group. And there's usually a pretty strong picture of what that looks like. And there's a value of loyalty, of working in service to this is our group, where it's almost as if my identity gets subsumed or confused. It's fused with the identity of the group. So if my group is successful, I'm successful. If my group fails, I fail. And then there's usually a pretty strong sanction or drawback if I don't follow the norms of the group, where I might get kicked out of the group. I might be exiled or excommunicated, and that can be kind of disastrous sometimes when our whole life is tied up into being in that group. So within that kind of social context, within the mythic traditional paradigm, the identities that I'm able to hold and the possibility space that I get to play in is defined by that worldview within that social structure. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, or there's no value judgment here. I'm just describing that this is one way that humans organize themselves. And then within that, there are worldviews. Many people exist primarily within these social contexts today, and it's not the only one. So the next worldview that I want to discuss, we'll call it the mental modern worldview. And, mythic, traditional, mental, modern, these words come from somewhere that is outside of the scope of what I want to cover today, but they give us a label that we can then refer back to later. So in the mythic traditional, just one little piece here, you can visualize this social structure as a pyramid. And inside the pyramid are all the members of the group. And there are a couple of people or one person who holds most of the authority of the group, and they're at the top of the pyramid. And they give forth the moral and ethical and behavioral guidelines, the norms of the group. And then everybody inside the group is kind of working to maintain the integrity and structure of that pyramid. Okay, so that's the visual of the mythic traditional paradigm. Now, the visual I want to give you of the mental modern paradigm is different. Imagine you have a piece of graph paper with all those little squares on it, right? Each square is really well defined. They're all exactly the same size. They are fungible. They're identical. Now, your project here is to get as many little colored cubes on your graph paper, colored squares, as possible. So your job is to produce them through whatever work you were doing, and then to accumulate them and hold them and to have a lot of them. And it's not only about producing a lot and having a lot, but it's also about being recognized as you are either a high achiever or a low achiever, but you're somewhere on the ladder, and the esteem of your peers is also really important here. So for me, this context was maybe middle school and definitely high school and then into college, where The social system of my classroom was set up, okay, here's a subject. My job is to learn about this subject, certain facts or capacities, math skills, whatever it is. And then we're going to give you a test, and we're going to score you how well you do, and we're going to give you points. And those points are your grade, and then we'll put them all together, and that's your grade point average, right? So how many little cubes did you get? And then how high I was on my grade point average determined in large part which school I got to go to next. And so there's a focus on achievement here. And then that translates into much of the corporate world. But instead of using points, we're now using dollars. So profit or my salary. And instead of using like the honor roll or how high up I am in terms of grade point average, we're now using my job title and my position within the company. And I am in competition with other people in my company. We're also cooperating often. And then the company is competing with other companies in the marketplace. And this social structure is set up around creating value and achievement. And within this social structure, there are certain identities that will become available to me, other options for how I show up and engage and what my values are and what my ethics are. And it's a different me that becomes possible in this type of social space as opposed to the mythic traditional, more conforming to the pyramid structure, in-group, out-group affiliation, social structure, right? So different identities and different worldviews become available depending on the social context that I'm in. Great. So now I want to move on to the next paradigm, which I will call the postmodern paradigm. And in order to do that, we're going to utilize a way of looking at the world, which is called the systems view. And we've actually been utilizing the systems view so far in this talk already. So when we look at the pyramid structure, or when we look at the graph paper structure, that's the system. Well, what happens at the postmodern level of development is we start to be able to see the system. So prior to that, the system is just a given. And I'm doing my best to optimize for my values inside of the system as it is. I want to do my best in this context. But at the postmodern level of development, I can start to see, well, hey, there is a system at play here. This social system was created by humans and perpetuates itself because we all agree on the rules and the dynamics of the system. And, as we look at the system, it doesn't really operate that great. There's some issues with the system. And because humans created the system, that means that humans can change the system. And not only the system at large, but, it's almost like, okay, the other example I want to give here. I'm a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons. I played for many, many years. So this is my analogy. It's like society and our family hands us a character sheet. And on the character sheet are all of these attributes of who you are, your identity. So for me, on the character sheet that I got handed, white, male, upper middle class, Catholic, a whole bunch of other group identities that I was given. And at the postmodern level of development, we start to look at our character sheet and we go, oh, this is what society thinks is me, but this is not necessarily what is me. In fact, I can get my eraser out and I can start to change some of these because I don't think that, for example, I don't think that being a male in the way that, the mythic traditional paradigm portrays being a man works for me. So I'm either going to let go of that or I'm going to do something else. And so these it's called social constructs like American or monogamy are given to us and conditioned into us. And then at the postmodern worldview, we start to see that. And then we become able to change that. And one of the key words for the postmodern paradigm is deconstruction. I am deconstructing these conditioned identities, and I am working towards deconstructing the oppressive or harmful aspects of our social system. And I want to say a little bit more about systems, because systems are really important here. In the modern worldview, and in the modern paradigm, actually, mass media is broadcast. So we have radio, we have network and cable television, and there's one source which then distributes to many people who receive. Social networks are fundamentally different. In a social network, every single one of us is a node that both produces content, produces whatever tidbit goes into the network, and receives and consumes that content, but also transmits it and remixes it and engages with it. And so there's this mesh of all of these little points that both give and receive, and the properties of that mesh are emergent. They're chaotic. They're fuzzy. Emergent means you have to look at the network on the level of the system itself, that it's not analyzable into any of its component parts. This is fundamentally different from, it's what's called scientific materialism of the mental modern paradigm, which basically looks at everything in terms of ping pong balls acting according to a set of rules. And in the postmodern paradigm and in 20th century physics, we went from ping pong balls being our model for atoms to fields that are indeterminate, sometimes act like a particle, sometimes act like a wave. And that's just one example. Chaos theory is another example, where there are systems like our atmosphere that are so complex that these tiny little perturbations can create huge effects further on in the system. So much so that it's basically utterly unpredictable, and yet within that there are these attractors, there are these larger patterns which then reveal themselves. So this is the postmodern paradigm describing a world which is chaotic, fuzzy, emergent, and complex. It's a system. So within the system, which, just to give more of a human culture example, our stock market is an emergent, fuzzy, complex thing. And it goes up sometimes and down sometimes, and we think we're going to change these inputs and it's going to go a certain direction, but then it doesn't. So humans live in a system, and society is messy, and it's chaotic, and it's emergent. And when I understand myself within a system, within a network, who I get to be, and how I engage with my world, and what values I hold, all of these things are different. And so then, how is it different? What different options become available at postmodern? Well, I already mentioned deconstruction, right? In academia, queer theory, second and third wave feminism, the idea is we can take apart these social group identities that no longer serve us, race, class, gender, and we can remove the conditioning to get down, to become free of it, basically. And then we have transcended that social construct that was laid upon us, and we become more free as humans. And also our system, our social system, becomes more free because we stop doing these oppressive actions that are systemic, that are built into how the structure works. Now, the systems view also applies internally. So we're not just seeing systems in physics and in the economy. But one of the hot psychotherapy modalities today is called internal family systems, IFS. And this modality recognizes that each one of us in our psyche have a number of different parts. And these parts have their own identities, their own agendas, and they are in relationship with each other. They're an internal family system. So I have a manager part, and I have a skeptic part who goes, I'm not so sure about that. And I have a victim part who goes, oh, poor me, look at what happened to me. All of these different parts are in this dynamic tension. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't work together. And at different times, one of them may come to the surface and kind of take over my behavior. And that this is a more holistic, more complex way to understand psychologically who I am. I'm a collection of parts. Now, the trap, I'll say, one of the pitfalls of the postmodern project of deconstruction and looking at all these different parts is the question of, well, we're teasing apart what's not true, but when we get down to the bottom of it, where do we land? Where are we trying to get to? And the postmodern paradigm doesn't really have a great answer to that. Sometimes the deconstruction is into noise or chaos or oblivion. Sometimes the deconstruction is into total relativism, where whatever is true for you, but what's true for me is true for me. Or even nihilism, of like nothing even matters anymore. There is no truth. And these are kind of scary, and they can be a scary place to go, but also they don't hold a lot of integrity when we really start to poke at them. Like relativism, for example, says that all truth is relative to the observer, right? But that claim itself, all truth is relative, is an objective, universal claim of truth. And so people who get really into relativism pretty quickly run into that. It's called a performative contradiction, where it's saying all truth is relative, but it's using a universal truth to make that claim. And so the statement itself contradicts what it's trying to claim. And more broadly than that, the meaninglessness, the identityness, the total dissolution, people tend to not hang out there too long because life has meaning and because there are aspects of our identity that matter. And because at a very basic level, if we deconstruct all of the conditioning that society gives us, that means we check out of society pretty completely. And our incentives are actually aligned against that. We are very social animals who want to participate with other humans in a meaningful way. And so the goal of postmodernism, like the value there, is to get rid of, to let go of, to deconstruct the aspects that are not working for us so that we can connect with a richer, fuller, freer self and culture. And the natural progression of like tearing down will lead us inevitably, if we continue to learn and grow, into the next paradigm. So the next one is called integral. And there is not a cultural foothold in our society today, though it's growing and it could happen very quickly where we hit kind of a tipping point. But as of right now, halfway through 2024, there is no integral culture vanguard that's making big changes in how we understand ourselves and the world in our culture. So part of this is provisional, but the next step is into wholeness. So integral, the word, is related to integrating, bringing together, and it's related to integer and integrity. integers are whole numbers, and integrity is like cohesion. So the integral paradigm is about bringing disparate parts together and recognizing their inherent wholeness. And it's a natural kind of complement to the breakdown deconstruction project of postmodernity. And as we step back into wholeness, we find that authentic version of ourselves. So the image I want to give of the integral paradigm is like a honeycomb lattice. All the little hexagons that kind of stack together, where there's a whole self, and the structure of the self is coherent and symmetrical and harmonized. And then I see myself as embedded within ecosystem and culture and community and spirituality and science. All of these other aspects of life start to fit together into this regular, harmonious tiling, which is itself its own whole. Now, there's a word here that I want to introduce, which is holon. Holon. Holon is the quality of being simultaneously a part and a whole part, if you will. And integral not only values wholeness, but it sees whole parts, which means a cell is a whole entity in and of itself, but it's also a part of the tissue and the organ and the organism. And then within the cell, it has subparts, and it has molecules, which in turn have atoms, which in turn have subatomic particles. And each one of these entities is whole in and of itself, but also part of the larger entity in which it participates. And so the integral view is about recognizing the interlocking, interweaving connections across all of these dimensions. Integral sees wholeness. And whereas in the postmodern paradigm, we're recognizing and we're looking through a systems view, now at integral, we're looking through a process view. So the process is whatever is happening now. It's the dynamic change that is occurring, which includes both the structure, the components, and the system or the pattern. So the mental modern worldview, the atomistic universe, looks at structure. And then in plural postmodern, we look at systems. And then in the integral view, we take another step back and we say, well, there are all of these structures that engage in these systems, but then these systems change over time. And there are ways that the pattern influences the structure and ways that the structure influences the pattern. And that is called the process. So integral sees processes. Processes can be virtuous, meaning they are naturally moving towards greater degrees of wholeness and complexity. Processes can be vicious. They are tearing themselves down towards either death or fear or dissolution. And that is how integral views self as a process, society, ecosystem, cosmos. Who I get to be within the integral paradigm is different than the options that are available to me in any of the other paradigms that have come before. One of the core values at integral is evolution, so virtuous processes. It's moving towards our own growth, our own development. Other words for this are self-actualization and self-authorship. We are working to be the most fulfilled, most expressed versions of ourselves that we can. And as we step into more and more self-actualization, that value then starts to percolate outwards. And we want other people and other communities to also self-actualize. But self-actualization, baked into the word, is self. So it's not a top-down approach. It's not saying, I know what's best for you and I want you to do this. It's saying, I want to create the conditions for you to actualize yourself, however that looks like. And I'm going to trust in your process to deliver that for you. The other kind of amazing thing about the integral worldview is that it focuses on perspectives. It sees paradigms, it sees worldviews. So again, from the beginning, we've been kind of using the integral perspective in having the conversation about worldviews. So from integral, I can look kind of backwards. I can look down the developmental ladder, and I can see that each one of these other worldviews and paradigms is an internally valid, internally coherent, useful, necessary developmental step. So the mythic traditional paradigm, when one is inside of that paradigm, the worldview makes sense. It's coherent. It's valid. From outside of that paradigm, I may not agree with what those people think or the actions that they take, but I can see that it's a valid thing. And that phase of development is necessary to grow through in order to get to the mental modern paradigm. You can't skip a step, and so these are sequential growth levels, like rungs on a ladder that we are moving through. Similarly, I can see that the mental modern paradigm is a coherent, consistent way to organize self and world. And I can see that in order to get to postmodern, the systems view, I have to grow through the mental modern paradigm. So each one of these paradigms is necessary, it's useful. They may be out of balance, they may be causing harm, but that doesn't mean that we can get rid of them. In fact, they need to be here in order for integral to continue to exist. And so the goal is not to get rid of people like that or people within those worldviews and those paradigms. The goal is actually to support them to come into healthy versions within that worldview, and then to give them the tools and resources, if they so choose, to advance, to grow. And we can see that the pathway of the development of worldviews has this universal character to it. Yes, there are cultural specific trappings that we put on it, but broadly speaking, I haven't said anything about a specific religion or a specific political party or a specific, country. As far as we can tell, all humans move through these phases of development, and they apply to our cognitive intelligence, our emotional intelligence, our visual spatial intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. There seems to be this universal pathway of development for humans, or for the consciousness that humans hold. Now, we've gone through 4 of them. We have no reason to think that integral is the final one. In fact, some authors have sketched out high integral and even other paradigms beyond that. Humans are going to continue to grow and develop, assuming that our civilization continues to exist on this planet. But these are the 4 main ones that are most relevant for our society and our culture today. And it's by studying these worldviews that I can see, okay, that's where in my life I was in that worldview. That's how I participated in it. This is what I liked about it. This is what I didn't like about it. Here's where I'm still in that space. And then I can look at what's the next step to grow beyond where that is. So I can find the places in me that are still kind of hanging back in the mythic traditional paradigm or the mental modern paradigm, and I can update them. And this is the exciting place for me around growth and personal development. So having shared all of these pieces around how I think about worldviews and the evolution of consciousness, I now want to share with you the Living Kosmos worldview. Because as I have been working with this brand for almost 4 years now, I have what is this thing that I'm doing, Living Kosmos? And I've come to understand that primarily it's a worldview. And by studying worldviews, we become changed. In order to step into the new worldview, I need to transform who I am. And that's a really remarkable statement right there. And so we say that studying consciousness is psychoactive, that it changes our psyche. So given that, here is the Living Kosmos worldview, briefly. There are 4 main tenets and 5 principles that I have right now, and this, will probably continue to evolve. So the 4 tenets are non-dual, evolving, pan-experiential, and pan-semiotic. And I want to give you a little bit to explain each of these 4 tenets. Non-dual is a word which means not to. We live in a universe in which we are embedded. We are vastly interconnected. So the atoms in the air that you are breathing right now are atoms that were breathed by the Buddha and Jesus and Hitler and Donald Trump. The atoms in your breath right now were breathed by all the other humans who ever came before us. And they are entering in to become part of your body. This is how vastly interconnected we are. We live in sometimes a very useful understanding of ourselves as separate, but in fact, we are not separate from reality and from the cosmos, from all that is. Non-dual is the recognition of the essential unity with diversity of this experience of reality that we are having. So that's the first tenet, non-dual. The next tenet is evolving. And we've already done a good amount of tracing how human worldviews evolve. But this applies not only to humans, it applies to biological life, and in fact, it applies to the entire universe as a whole. A little over 13 billion years ago, by our best guess, the universe was a pretty uniform, undifferentiated soup of protons, electrons, neutrons, a couple of other things, and a bunch of light. That soup cooled and expanded and evolved to become galaxies and clusters of galaxies and quasars and the first stars. Those stars lived their life cycle. Some of the bigger ones collapsed and exploded in a supernova. And in the intensity of that collapse and explosion, all of the heavier elements were formed. Eventually, accretion disks formed with enough heavier elements that we were able to get the sun and the earth and you and me. So there has been a process of physical evolution that the cosmos has gone through. And then over the course of the lifetime of the earth, we've had the emergence of biological life. Biological life is, from a systems view, fundamentally different from a physical system. Biological life takes in nutrients and emits wastes and creates homeostasis. It interacts with its environment to keep that environment suitable for its living conditions. It creates offspring and passes down its memory through DNA. And basically, it's an autonomous process of self-replication. So life does this. And then at a certain point, life got complex enough for self-reflexive consciousness to emerge. And, usually we say humans. But I want to also add in here that if you put a mirror in front of chimpanzees and elephants or dolphins, they will all recognize themselves and play with themselves in front of the mirror in the same way that a small child does. Life got complex enough for the consciousness, the awareness to look at itself and go, oh, that's me. There is a me here that I can see. And that was a monumental leap in the evolution of consciousness. And so the evolution of the cosmos is moving indelibly towards greater degrees of wholeness and more complexification. Our evolution as humans and our evolution as individuals is not separate from the evolution of the cosmos. Our capacity to evolve, what we accomplish as a species or as an individual, then contributes back to all of life. So we live in an evolving cosmos. That's tenet number 2. The next tenet is pan-experiential. So pan means universal and experience means experience. The idea here is that every entity has both an exterior, material, phenomenal manifestation and an interior, experiential, subjective awareness. So you and me have this, right? We have bodies, we make actions out in 3D reality, that's the outside. We have an inside, we have a psyche, we have an interior awareness of what's happening. When we look at other animals, they clearly have this too. When we look at plants, they respond to their environment, they grow towards the light. There's no one place where we can draw the line and say, the interior of experience, meaning basically consciousness, stops here. And the proposition of pan-experientialism is that the interior of experience goes all the way up and all the way down. So every electron has some type of internal prehension, no matter how faint. And that it is a core feature of each entity in the universe, in the cosmos, to have both an outside and an inside. Pan-experientialism. In addition, if we then turn to integral theory, it posits both an outside and an inside, and then also collectives, which are basically systems. And as we've already discussed, systems have to be understood on the level of the system itself. You can't look at the individual members of the system to understand what's happening at the system level. Systems, collectives, also have an exterior and an interior. So the exterior of a system is a society or an ecosystem or an atmosphere. The internal of a collective is the culture. So humans have shared language and meaning. Wolves have a pack mentality. Schools of fish have, school herd mentality. That's the interior of the collective. So these are the 4 quadrants of integral theory, but the core tenet here is pan-experientialism, which basically for me means that consciousness is a fundamental ingredient of the cosmos. And then the 4th aspect is pan-semiotic. So again, pan means universal. Semiotic means symbolic. It means meaningful. And this tenet, for me, weaves in the Jungian perspective of the archetypes. So we all dream. And in our dreams, we have these symbols that show up. And the same symbols show up for individuals across different cultures, across different time periods, and they seem to have this universal quality to it. And these symbols also show up in our religious stories, our myths, and our media. Again and again and again, across cultures, across times. And so the idea is, well, how do we explain this? There must be a collective unconscious that we all can tap into with a repository of these universal symbols, archetypes. Archetypes are a feature of the cosmos, and they imbue the cosmos with meaning. An archetype is basically a pattern of meaning. Another way to look at this is that all phenomena has meaning. So you could consider that any physical particle or physical manifestation is encoded light. Any biological organism or group of organisms is encoded aliveness. And any communication or language is encoded self-reflexive consciousness. And at different levels of complexity, the depth of meaning is deeper, it's more. But there is meaning everywhere we look, and it is a fundamental feature of the cosmos. So these are the 4 tenets. And from these, we start to extrapolate, who am I, and what is this place, and how do I know myself in this cosmos? Together with these tenets are 5 principles for how we engage. And this is kind of the culture, but it's also the governance for the structure for how to show up in a good way and support each other at Living Kosmos. So there's 5 principles, and I want to give you them briefly because they support the worldview. They are the policies or the norms or the structures that allow for the worldview to flourish. So the first principle is nonviolence. And nonviolence means doing no harm. This applies physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, ecologically. It applies to ethnic groups. Wherever we find an entity or a collective, we want to do no harm. Pretty straightforward. The next principle is sustainability. Sustainability means we are meeting and fulfilling all of our needs today without compromising the needs of those who come after us. One way to think about nonviolence is it means fulfilling the needs of each person or each entity that we interact with. Sustainability means we're not only fulfilling our own needs, but we're also ensuring that those who come next can do the same. The next principle is organicity, and this is a word that comes from the type of psychotherapy that I'm trained in, which is called Hakomi. And I've already touched on this a little bit too. Organicity means life has a natural, innate drive to move towards its own healing, well-being, and wholeness. And that given the right resources and support, all of us will naturally do that. Organicity is the organic nature to grow and create and reproduce and create the conditions that are conducive for life. The fourth principle is inclusion. Inclusion here means that all humans have a ground value. We are all precious because we are human. And so we want to make space for anyone who is aligning to these principles to participate in Living Kosmos. Inclusion also applies to perspectives and modes of thought. So every religion, every spiritual tradition, every philosophy, every science, every mode of knowledge production has some kernel of truth in it. And so we want to make space for that. And also, the fact that we are in an evolving cosmos, and with the series of paradigms that we've just walked through, we can also recognize that there are more expansive, more holistic truths than others. And whichever paradigm we are in will tend to produce more holistic, more broad truths. With that comes the recognition that there is no final, fully true truth. And that's a little bit of a relief for me. We're always going to be growing and evolving. including these tenets and these principles and these paradigms, right? And because of that, whatever we see as true today is going to become the foundation for a more expansive, more inclusive truth tomorrow. And that's part of this inclusion piece, is the ongoing evolutionary nature of what we believe to be true. And the final principle is my favorite, is humanness. And the way that I relate to this is being human first. And this is how I orient within myself. So for whatever reason, I came here to have a human experience in this life. Now, because of the consciousness that I have access to, that we all have access to, we have the opportunity to explore countless realms, states of consciousness, shamanic realms, planes, and that this is our birthright as humans. We get to go explore these realms if we wish. Oftentimes, in my life, I've had to leave my human experience behind in order to go touch those places. And so this principle for me is about staying. It's about choosing to inhabit my ordinary, mundane, messy human experience first. And by centering in my heart, that creates the trustable place for all the variety of experience to be integrated and received in my system. In my heart, I can open to receive the entire cosmos. And I can do this without dissociation or without bypass. And that is what being human first means for me. So this is my approach today. And this is the worldview of Living Kosmos. It's something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and that I have spent a significant portion of my life force over the last 4 years working on this, bringing this into my integrated self to understand this. From these tenets and these principles, there is an incredible amount of material to now understand and explore and experience. And that's what I'm excited about, and that's where we're going to be going next in this podcast as these episodes unfold. So thanks for joining me so far, and I'm excited to be on the adventure with you. Thank you for joining us today for the Living Kosmos podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a review and a rating on whatever podcast platform you use to access it. If you'd like to go deeper, I'd encourage you to head over to livingkosmos.com, where I have a whole host of free videos and resources, as well as whatever courses I'm offering today. You can also check out my book, The Organic Masculine, and connect with me on the Living Kosmos Facebook group. Thanks again, and aloha.